So good evening, everyone, and welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Dalila Colucci, and I am a Maria Zambrano Distinguished Fellow here at the University of Seville. And tonight, I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing Professor Jessica Hemmings, who is here to deliver a lecture within the course on book culture, literacy, and the transmission of knowledge that I am currently teaching within the MELLC Master, the Master en Estudios Lingüísticos, Literarios y Culturales here at the University of Seville. So, Jessica Hemmings is a professor of craft at HDK Valland University of Gothenburg in Sweden. She's also visiting professor with the doctoral school of Molly Nagy University of Art and Design in Budapest, Hungary, and the Rita Bollen Fellow at the Research Center for Material Culture in the Netherlands. As most of you already know, she writes about textiles. Some of these words form academic research, others are read as journalism. Her research interests span material culture and literature to include post-colonial literature and contemporary craft and life writing, embodied knowledge, and storytelling in the archive. She has published extensively on the topic. I'm going to remember here that she's author of Yvonne Vera, The Voice of Cloth, published in 2008, Warp and Weft, Woven Textiles in Fashion, Art and Interiors, published in 2012, and she has edited many volumes, among which Cultural Threads, Transnational Textiles Today, 2015, In the Loop, Knitting Now, 2012, and of course, the very famous The Textile Reader, first published in 2012, and then again in 2023. Based on Cultural Threads, she also curated the international traveling exhibition, Migrations, which is, if I understand correctly, was exhibited in between 2015 and 2017. Recent writings includes Can That Be Thought? Lessons in Tacit Knowledge, published in the volume Some Aesthetics and Design Culture, published by Brill in 2023. Material Sense, Textiles Beyond Touch, included in the volume Kinetic Intelligence in the Humanities, forthcoming with Routledge in 2024. This month, yeah. But with the year 2024, and Toward a Minor Textile Architecture, published in Entangled Histories of Art and Migration for Intellect, also 2024, right? Mm-hmm. Translations of her writings have appeared in French, Hungarian, Icelandic, Norwegian, Portuguese, Russian, and Swedish. Tonight, she will be talking about testing textile text, the material narratives of Florencia Wolfish, Andreas Esbach, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, and Sheila Hicks. So thank you very much, Professor Hemmings, for being with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction and the invitation to speak to you this evening. We met, am I not on? Better? Yes? Okay. We met, if you can call it meeting, at an online conference. That's why I question if we met or not. That was about textile poetics last summer. And as you've just heard, I am myopic in my interest in textiles, totally obsessed. And if it's about textiles, then I'm interested. And if it's not, then I can fall asleep quite quickly, which is shameful. But what I've used this evening as a little bit of an excuse to talk to you is something that has moved back and forth in my career, and maybe some of you might find this in future yourselves, or even be wondering or thinking this way at the moment. And that's that I studied textile design as a art student, as a design student, but I became interested in literature while I was taking that undergraduate degree. And I became interested in a very particular thing in literature. I warned you about my myopic interest. I became interested in textiles in literature exclusively. And for quite a long time now, I have toggled back and forth between those things, looking for stories that contain textiles and trying to understand what the textile is saying, which was a little bit what my PhD was about. I wrote about a Zimbabwean author who we cannot prove, but I felt was able to say things as a criticism to Mugabe's government at the time through textile metaphor that otherwise could have caused her problems, because she held a government job. She was the director of the National Gallery of Bulawayo. To criticize the government continues to be problematic in that country, but certainly to criticize the government while holding a government job is even more precarious. But what I'll also touch upon this evening is that I'm always looking for that other thing, which is textiles that contain texts. So textiles tell stories in all sorts of ways, but I actually mean that sometimes quite literally. Language that exists on cloth. So I will go back and forwards a little bit, and then I recognize that this is a book culture course. So I promise you we will end here. I will try to. It's not my confidence point, but it's, I think, a really interesting physical artifact that we can talk about at the end. I'm very happy to be interrupted along the way. I can, on a good day, remember what I was going to say next, or if not, I'll say something else. So you're welcome to put your hand up and stop me along the way, or we also can do the discussion afterwards. So this is probably a good example. I'll start with just a couple of examples of the types of writing that I have done to maybe give you a sense of where my interests land. What happens when you study textile design and then you study comparative literature and then you write a PhD on Zimbabwean literature? What does that make you as an academic? So Faith Ringgold is an African-American artist, and she works in many different ways, but one of the ways that she works, which I hope you can, well, you're going to have to take it on trust that the white panels left and right can contain handwriting. They are text. And this purple quilt is quite literally an homage to Alice Walker's The Color Purple, and so she's actually painted out the characters and used some of the text. It's not the only way that Ringgold works. It was the reading that I suggested might be interesting to you, and it's this starting point which is the type of thing that really sparks my thinking. So you can imagine that holding the academic title of a professor of craft sort of lands differently on different academic contexts. Some people think it's the coolest thing they've ever heard, and some people think it's the biggest joke that they've ever heard. And I know that. And one of the things that I have come to peace with and terms with, and actually one of the things that I think has long interested me, but it took me a long time to name it, is actually maybe this idea that what we underestimate in the textile and in the domestic can sometimes be very powerful as well. So I referred to the potential censorship of Yvonne Vera, the author I wrote on for my PhD. We have other really powerful examples around the world when radio and text and books that look like books are censored and messages on cloth are overlooked because it's women's work and it's just pieces of cloth. And I find that I've always found that interesting, but I have sort of increasingly held on to that as when I hear the chuckles in the room about a professor of craft, I think, well, be careful, because maybe that's actually one of the ways this mechanism works, is that in being overlooked by some people, it allows other people to speak or other things to be heard in different contexts. So the article on Faith Ringgold started because this is just before the pandemic. I was in London and happened to hear her at this talk. And she recounted this story, which is the grey text in the center of the screen, about she understood. She had been commissioned to write her memoir. That was the agreement with the publisher. I told you that Ringgold is an African-American artist, and she delivered the text and at least her version of the story to us. I recognize it's her interpretation of events, but was the publisher then rejected the manuscript and told her, this isn't your story. And something sort of quite prurient or alarming seemed to sit under that there was an expectation of recounting a life different than what Ringgold actually had lived and wanted to recount, which was something quite nice. She lived in Harlem in a very vibrant time. Her parents were very supportive of her education. She first trained as a teacher because that was the one subject as a woman she could study, but then leveraged that and moved into the arts. And as this quote says, "My life had not been a horror. I hadn't gotten raped and thrown out the window, beat up and all that. That didn't happen to me. So what am I supposed to do? Make that up so I get published?" And maybe some of them did that too, I don't know. But I decided I wanted to tell my story. And so this has struck me as quite a serious warning about identity politics and expectations, and also the mechanisms of the publishing world and what sells. But of course, it suits my purposes perfectly, because what she then says is that she turns to cloth as this place of a type of freedom, and publishing maybe without this assumption. So you can imagine that if I'm very attracted to this idea that to publish on cloth as opposed to on paper is something that I've long been interested in. And so she writes out these stories. That first one that I showed you, quite a literal and understandable. I mean, The Color Purple is an absolutely remarkable novel. No, if anything deserves honoring, then a good one to pick. But also examples like this. I'm sorry that this is quite small, but it's titled "Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima?" And what she's actually referring to is a piece of American culture. So Aunt Jemima is a brand of cooking syrups, molasses honeys, and they have changed their branding recently. But for a long time, it was a black woman. It changed over the years, but it was a black woman's face, sometimes with a cloth on her head, certainly suggesting, if not an enslaved person, then certainly domestic work. And it only very, very recently has that branding actually even changed. But this story of Aunt Jemima, Aunt Jemima's an entrepreneur, and she becomes very wealthy and very successful. And so this is, again, Ringgold taking another stereotype and running with it by overturning it. And using it in an entirely different context, and saying that that identity of that enslaved or that woman who is associated with domestic help. What if she was this amazing business success? What if that was our Aunt Jemima? So I recognize needs a little bit of access point into American culture, but they read a little bit like cartoons, and I mean that in the sense that there's a chronology as the panels move across. So this is another type of practice that you can probably imagine why I'm excited or interested, how it sort of fits the things that I'm always trying to get my hands on. Arcebispo de Rosario was a Brazilian artist. He is no longer alive, and he lived many lives. He was in the Navy. He was a professional boxer, and he spent a huge amount of his life, not of his choice, in psychiatric institutions. He also spent parts of his life in psychiatric institutions that were of his choice. Sometimes he was held not of his free will, and sometimes he stayed in those contexts. He believed that he needed to prepare for the second coming of the Lord, and he had been chosen to catalog everything around him in preparation for this. So these are records of the names that begin with the letter A. The image is stretched a tiny bit, I think, because the proportions are bed sheets. So he worked with the materials within the institution. People, this is going, we don't know when he was born, but maybe 1912, 1915, we don't know his exact date of birth. But this was not a time in psychiatric care where, for instance, people were given art materials to work with, or these were materials that he would have recycled from a context around him. So there are sculptures made with hundreds of plastic spoons, flip-flops. He also made garments to be ready for this moment. And on the right-hand side of your screen, those are also records, for instance, of all of the different shapes of ships that he learnt about. So an incredible archiving undertaking that he was told, he explained to others very strongly. He was directed by voices to create a catalogue to be ready. But this is, so if Ringgold turned to cloth to tell her story, Bispo de Rosario in a different way is also doing the same thing. And there is some very, of course, beautiful research about his perspective and his identity, and who really has an accurate insight into the world that we live in, because there is a lot around us, more now than ever, that doesn't seem very sane. And so there are a lot of people who have pointed out sort of this collecting of things. Isn't that the same as the Victorian Museum agenda and all sorts of other policies which are about categorizing and cataloging? The blue is also thread taken from the uniforms that they wore. So an incredible labor of dismantling something in order to have the tools to be able to then stitch these names on. I know it's not very clear, and I'm really happy to share the slides or look at them on a screen later if you want to look at anything in more detail. So I do have an interest also. This is the back side of the same artifact. I do also have a relatively new interest in these types of practices that occur in contexts where there is a loss of personal freedom and materials are not overtly provided, so they come from some type of recycling and ingenuity mechanism. I promise you I am getting to the point of this lecture soon. These are just some other things that I've worked on. I had a very, very generous visit to the Dutch National Library in The Hague as part of the Rita Boland Fellowship, because I'm looking into batik book covers. And these are all batik book covers, some on parchment and some, the ones nearest the screen where my two images cut, actually velvet. The Dutch colonized the islands that today we call the nation of Indonesia, and there was a lot of exchange between European artists and batik, which is a textile patterning tradition which actually shows up in many parts of the world. They have, the Indonesians have UNESCO intangible heritage status for batik, but it was a fraught process. There are many other places that also have very rich traditions. It requires somebody to think in reverse, because you don't add color onto the cloth, but you use a resist, usually wax, wax, sometimes rice paste, to block out where you don't want the dye to touch. So you have to think the whole thing through backwards, which is quite a trick. Those books in the very, very front happen to also be a novel where they're talking about the impending decline of the colonial era, and again, in Jessica Hemmings' reading of these things, the textiles are always collapsing around the characters. You know, this moment is breaking apart, and it's breaking apart materially as well as politically. The batik book covers that I'm researching for this project were made by women prisoners in 1910, 1915, 1920. And they were never attached to books, at least the ones in the Tropen Museum collection that I'm looking at. And so this has become a speculative project about the stories those book covers never told, never held. So they haven't been dismantled. And some of them are made of silk, which is odd, because that's not a very hard-wearing material to cover a book in. But they're examples of early tourist art, because they were really catering to visitors, Dutch family members who were bringing gifts back to their families. So it's one day I'll tell you what has happened with this misbehaving project, but I'm trying to collaborate with others to conjure the stories those book covers might have held. And then I also feel a little bit responsible as a professor of craft for sometimes being quite grumpy. So craftivism, which might not be a word for you, but is very hot in the places where I work, the melding of craft and activism is very much celebrated as sort of a protest statement, and I'm very troubled by how much it can really do. And I lived in Indonesia as a child. This is one of the reasons why I have some of these interests, and I feel that we deserve to be a little bit more responsible for some of the problems that the world faces and some of the conditions under which craft is made, rather than a slightly romantic veneer, which certainly is a lot easier to adopt in Europe or in North America. So this is my flip side. So I've shown you material, and this is the other thing that I'm always looking for excuses to do. This was an Isabel Allende book, a Rohinton mystery, The Fine Balance, and Yvonne Vera, looking at their craft characters and pointing out that these are all novels where craft changes nothing. Their poverty, the challenges they face in these novels, craft is not some type of survival or savior in these contexts, and that is because it really often isn't in the world as well. And as a professor of craft, nobody else wants to say this, so I will point out that sometimes it is also a form of incredible oppression, not only just this thing that allows us to communicate personally or artistically. There. So that's what I do. I'm always jumping back and forth between these textiles in texts and these texts on textiles. And so the first person I thought of for you today is the artist who is on the cover of the second edition of the Textile Reader. I had just a wonderful chance to come across an exhibition of her work when I was traveling in Argentina, and we were able to meet. And this piece is called Language, so I could not resist the idea that it went on the cover. And I like the cover of this book. This is no disrespect or discredit to the designer of the cover of the book, but that is not really the point of her artwork, because that's the artwork, the full artwork. And I understand why the color is needed for the design of the book cover, but inside the book cover, it's in black and white, but we have this this printed with the clause that what you see is only a detail on the front, because I think that the amount of white cloth she has left is crucial. That particularly if you look at what she's chosen to call it, that is a very, very important part of her artistic decision. She builds up a very heavy clamor of stitch, and in a couple of works I'll show you, she sometimes also literally uses words. But I couldn't help but think of a little short story by Isak Dinesen, the Danish author who is maybe most famous for Out of Africa, or the film if you haven't read the book. But The Blank Page is also by Isak Dinesen, and it tells the story of Carmelite nuns in Portugal. It's just a couple of pages. And they harvest the flax and weave the linen bed sheets, which are used in this story, in this fiction, by the royal family on the wedding night of their daughters in the family. The story opens with the fact that our narrator has been telling stories for more than 200 years. So we're positioned in a slightly different world from the outset. But I've just jumped to the conclusion only because I think it's crucial for Florencia's piece that's not on the book cover, which is all of the white page that remains as well. So you hear about the production of these bed sheets, and they are then framed after the wedding night and displayed on a wall. You, of course, are led to believe that all of them are somehow stained in some way to prove the virginity of the bride. I've come across this short story, though, anthologized in a collection of lesbian fiction. So there are many ways to read what is being said here. But the end of this story is that there is one framed, honored in exactly the same way as all of the other bed cloths, but it is pure white. And it is this blank page that both the family and also the nuns who produce the cloth sink into their deepest thought. So I've taken you down a little side road, but I couldn't not, because I think that the emptiness of the second part of that artwork is very important to understanding the whole of it as well. It's not just the density. The textile reader is an anthology, which I have promised that if anyone ever catches me talking about doing a third edition, I am meant to say no, because there are projects that are mostly about copyright clearance. So it is a gathering of existing writing about textiles, and because of my interests, I do include a fair bit of fiction and poetry, although it is, of course, conventional academic texts as well. I really believe that we can read theories through a lot of fiction and poetry, not simply the dryness of a lot of academic writing that, at least in the corner of the arts where I'm in, is often not very engaging, and that confuses me, because we're here to talk about things that we love, and then we sometimes flatten out our academic voice in a way that sort of denies our curiosity. So this is Florencia with a little bit of text as well. Body parts, bones. She's an artist that isn't particularly interested in giving a definitive reading of what the symbols in her artwork mean. She would much prefer for them to be open. But she certainly has, in conversation with me, talked about, for instance, thinking about her own body when she was carrying her daughter and pregnancy and changes that she felt. But equally also cannot deny the place, her identity and the place where she works. and the disappeared of Argentina, and the bones that remain unidentified in the land today. These are quite large, and I think physically quite difficult for the artist to make, as in hard physical work. Even if you don't sew, if you just think about a sewing machine and how you push that much fabric underneath it, and this is quite built up and dense, really quite strenuous work, which I think is also something we don't think of when we think of textiles. You know, textiles are also, and have in the past very much been ways to sort of control the female body, and this is sort of the opposite. This is really breaking apart, breaking open. I do not dare to read this to you, but I have spoken to my computer about it. I wanted to show you this because this room can do much more justice to both sides of this artist than I can, but she is very much a poet as well as a textile artist. And it's not that usual for people to have quite developed practices in several things, but it's not impossible. I'm sure you've come across examples in this course already. I think that this one caught my attention in particular because of her reference to these white handkerchiefs. We're working hopefully on an exhibition together next year where we'll somehow set some of this poetry beside some of her artwork, but not necessarily anything to do with chronology. This was a series, I believe, that was written when she had a residency in Mexico. But the white handkerchiefs that she talks about is something that you might be familiar with. But these are the mothers and now the grandmothers who continue to gather around a particular square in Argentina to hold peaceful protest. That's what the white is to symbol, to ask for more information about where their family members have gone, what happened to the disappeared. And it doesn't involve more than the white cloth and walking. So it's not another type of, it doesn't have another type of protest component to it, but this has been going on for a very, very long time, one day a week, every week. I think in a lot of my work, I'm also quite interested in this idea that, because I'm often asked this, that if somebody wants to look at that artwork and be astonished by its color or comforted by its beauty and not think about these things that I have just said, I don't think there's anything criminal about that. We absolutely need beauty in the world. And I think actually Florencia would say that she doesn't really invite that type of literal reading. It's usually academics like me who come along and want to dig up those types of interpretations. But I think that both in the writing that I'm attracted to and the textiles that I'm attracted to, the idea that we can sometimes get ourselves into a place of thinking about quite difficult things through an entry point of beauty is very powerful. And that it's not to be underestimated either. It's the same as what I said at the beginning, isn't it? Underestimate the textile if you want to, but then watch out, because that's exactly what, for some people, it then can be used for as the expression, a Trojan horse. It's got something else inside it. And if other people don't notice, or it only lands on some people, that's also okay. I think that variety is fine. So Andreas Eschbach is a German science fiction author. And I've become a little bit interested in science fiction, much to my mother's horror, recently, particularly because of, I suppose, my idea that I said at the beginning of trying to not slip into this romanticization of craft. And so the hair carpet weavers is a dystopic, absolutely a dystopic narrative. It also flips many, many stereotypes upside down. So the weavers are men, not women. And there has probably been a nuclear war because of the state of the land. And we have a fragmentation of communication between the planets, enormous isolation, living in absolutely subsistence conditions where one man must spend his life weaving a carpet out of the hair of his wives, plural, and the payment goes to an emperor who lives on another planet. So it's a taxation system that is keeping everyone too busy to think about having any type of uprising. The regulations of the community are that this carpet can only support one family unit. So instead of what we often hear about and the ongoing reality of ending the lives of daughters, in this particular planetary system, there can be only one son in each family. And so the father is obliged to kill every son that comes after the firstborn. So everything is flipped upside down. You know, it's not the women weaving, and it's not a type of femicide. And craft is the total antithesis of liberation. Craft is about oppression to keep people as busy and as controlled as possible in this system. And so this is also about a type of excess. An excess in the volume that gets produced because everybody is doing this, or the men are doing this work. But also we have a research group, of course we do, from another planet who comes to study tries to understand what is happening, which is difficult because the logic of the archive is only known by one person now, so human knowledge has been recorded, it does exist, but of course we've lost all of the roots back to get it. So it's the volume of this work that is being undertaken, and then of course the grotesqueness of the scale that is being asked. They really do mean human hair, so the damage to the weavers' bodies. So we get these types of descriptions in the introduction. Knot after knot, day in, day out for an entire lifetime, always the same hand movements, always looping the same knots in the fine hair, so fine and so tiny that with time the fingers trembled and the eyes became weak from strain, and still the progress was hardly noticeable. On a day he made good headway, there was a new piece of his carpet, perhaps as big as his fingernail. So I think that this is in its extremeness, a really interesting warning also about some of the compulsions that exist around craft, because most forms of craft activity do involve some type of repetition. It's often it can be the pleasurable part of it, but it can also slip into something that isn't particularly balanced or healthy. And so the dynamic of the materials that they're being asked to work with has created this incredible control mechanism on not on the planet, but on every planet. I won't spoil it and tell you why. It's not a really good reason why, but I also, and this has, I didn't know about the hair carpet weavers when I wrote about the smallness of craft, or it would have been in there as well. But this is also something that I feel that we do need to talk about, because it's not occurring in the knitting club that might meet in Starbucks every Friday evening, but a lot of craft work is very damaging to bodies, and bodies that don't have a huge amount of choice anyway. And of course it's refreshing in a perverse way that we are for once reading about the damage to a man's body. He squatted before the creaking carpet frame where his father and his father before him had sat, each with the same stooped posture and with the old filmy magnifying lens before his eyes, his arms propped against the worn breastboard, moving the knotting needle with only the tips of his fingers. We're talking about something just so minute. Thus he tied knot upon knot as it had been passed down to him for generations, until he slipped into a trance in which he felt whole, his back ceased to hurt, and he no longer felt the age in his bones. I have a bit of a problem with this last sentence, I must admit, that he too, Eschbach too, slips into this sort of romanticization of this damaging work. But I wanted to throw this example out to sort of rebalance the gender dynamic that occurs, because around the world these narratives are coming from both men and women, and it is all types of bodies that are involved, and it can be something that is very liberating and productive and a form of expression, and it can be a form of oppression. It can be all of the opposite of those things. And this is the explanation of how they mechanize the whole community behind this. So if you're not a weaver, then you're responsible for supporting the weaver. So everybody's going down together. Even if you're not the one at the loom, then you need to be preparing the food to support the weaver. So, and the emperor wasn't a myth, but is long gone. And this is part of this dystopic message, is because we've lost the ability to communicate amongst the planets, you don't even realize that you're worshipping, even if it was a false god, it's also, he has been overthrown long ago. And this is the really emotive part of this novel, because it is also something that frankly, it might sound extreme, but does come up in quite a lot of artistic practices, this idea of I am, absolute me, my body is my artwork. So if that doesn't work, then it's me that doesn't work. Or in this case, we get to the end of the narrative, and carpets have been lost for various reasons, fire and accidental damage, and that idea that this production is the entirety of the person's identity is, I think it's an interesting warning about how compulsive and how seductive this type of work can be, and how difficult it can be to turn around an ideology, and somebody who has lived with this their whole life, although all of his wives are saying, you can stop now. The emperor's gone, we know this, you can stop. And we have our one lone male character at the end who says, this was all I was, I can't stop. Not cheerful stuff. My mother points this out as well, that maybe you could find something a little bit more cheerful to spend your time studying. Okay, so we get to Sheila Hicks. Maybe I swapped the order around. I thought I couldn't possibly leave you with the hair carpet weavers. Everybody go home and have nightmares about what planets these things are happening on. Sheila Hicks was born in America. But she has spent the majority of her life living in Paris, and as a young woman also traveled extensively in South America. So she is at a minimum trilingual, as much as I understand. And she makes these very, very large works. So that's one of the things that she's famous for, is this. I'm sorry I don't have dimensions for you. This would be twice my height, or my height and half again. You're very much towering over my head height. So she's very celebrated for taking the textile again outside of a domestic scale, even though if any of you are familiar with embroidery floss and the little piece of paper that is often held around it to keep it from tangling. That's still the format that she's using. It's just, it would be up here if we were in this, if it was in the room. So that's a very dynamic way that she works. It was in Malaga over the summer, and so you can see, maybe you got a better sense of it there. It's in the background, and in the middle of that picture is a very interesting artwork because it is assembled in parts that are meant to be displayed dynamically, so they change arrangement, or they can change arrangement with every exhibition. And faintly along the wall you see framed pieces, and that is actually what this book is about, but you can just get a sense of their scale. It is in response to time she spent in Cordoba, and they are individual pieces of cloth with very long tassels. So it can be a stack, it can be a different shaped stack. She has quite a lot of work that is dynamic like this and not fixed, something that the textile really lends itself to. And so that brings me to this publication. So Hicks is maybe a bit of a contradiction, because I said she was so famous for those large works and taking the textile out of the domestic. She is not a young woman. She's well into her 80s now, and she's been making art that has been pretty well recognized most of her life. So some of these works are really quite early, but for the longest time she's also had this rather small series of works, which was along the Pompidou Malaga wall. And I know you'd have to be a textile nerd to appreciate this, but they are woven on 4 sides. And that's only interesting to a textile person, but she has a certain gridded way that she organizes the warp so that you don't have 2 frayed edges. They're up and down and then across, so they become a single closed unit at the end. It's a very simple portable frame that also meant she could always do this while she was traveling. And I thought of this book when we were talking about this course, because this is a book that predominantly documents collected together, often having to ask collectors and museums, and I'm sure probably friends as well, for access to these things, to take them back and photograph them. I have a picture of the book, but I must admit, well, maybe it got a bit fatter there. I mean, it's a very unusual proportion for a book to be so deep and not so large. Irma Bloom is the Dutch book designer, an extremely celebrated book designer who worked on this book for an exhibition of these artworks, and she talks about a number of really quite different decisions that she made. The classic one is that this doesn't have an artwork on the cover. It doesn't have, probably the image is actually easier to read than you'd have to see it in the light, but it's sort of the ghost of an artwork, or it's an impression of something that isn't there. In recorded interviews, she also admits that she forgot to put the title of the book on the cover. So it has Hicks, but it doesn't have anything else. And I'm really happy for you to, we'll pass this around afterwards, but it's got this incredible texture on the edges, which apparently is top secret. Nobody can know how it was done, but it's not a textile. It's not the same as the textiles, but I think it's a very interesting example of something that is paying so much attention to how physical it is when it happens to be a book whose content is about things that have a very special, particular physicality as well. She talks about other things which I'm not a graphic designer, so maybe I'm now straying really beyond my business, but unusual decisions about formatting as far as the font size shifting down over the course of an essay that I was reminded I was rather grumpy about when I reviewed this book a long time ago, which maybe I shouldn't have been, only because it's an essay that was already in existence, and I got on my high horse and said that we should be commissioning new textile writing. But an essay that is very, very much about the power of textiles by a late academic called Arthur Danto. But I leave you here with this physical thing. They've also chosen for the back cover the least colorful of her textiles, when she is someone that entirely works with cloth. It's not the blank page that Isak Dinesen wrote about, or Florencia Wolfish included in the bottom of her text, but it's got some of that going on. You know, the gaps that are left, maybe most particularly the idea that it is a monograph, isn't it? I mean, it's only about one artist, but that doesn't mean it gets summarized in a single artwork or a single, I should say a single title, but she is on record admitting that the fact that it doesn't have a title was a forgetful moment rather than a strategic plan, but a very sort of strange bravery, I suppose, not to fill in all of the gaps. And maybe all of the examples have a little bit of that I've shown you this evening, that for various reasons, I think that Arthur Rosario de Bispo ran out of time or ran out of letters. But all of these practices also have quite a lot of space and air and gaps around them. And I'm not sure that's an invitation for us to rush and fill things in. I don't think it's necessarily about that. It's just the very different shape that these practices take. So thank you for your attention, and we can certainly have a proper look at this as an artifact.
Thank you, Jessica, for this wonderful lecture, for taking us through this incredible path among all your interests, and specifically the works of these artists, female artists, which are really incredible. And thank you for leaving us with Sheila Hicks. Actually, it's particularly interesting to close with this book that somehow ties the conversation to what we've been doing in this class on book culture, of course, but also ties the text and textile in a very powerful way. So I would like for us to have a little discussion about these topics and themes, which are so rich. There is so much to unpack in what you've said, and so many things that would be worth exploring and expanding more, especially from our perspective, because of course you're an expert, and we are just, making a little incursions into this fantastic sphere of textile. That is certainly true for me. So I don't know if someone would like to start the debate, or I can ease the way in and start myself with a little question, observation, and I think that is going to be the case. So and then I'll give them some. I know, and I'm incredibly grateful for your time and your generosity in like guiding us through all this. I have to say that. Specifically, starting from the end, I was struck by the book. It's really a magnificent object, and it's like it also a little bit looks like I don't want to say a stone, but it has this heavy feeling, right? Even without touching it, and I'm curious actually to experience it's like touching a wall a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm struck by the the dynamics between the extreme materiality, the heaviness, the material, and what you said of this being a sort of a ghost of an artwork. Mm-hmm. It suggests me a sort of dynamic in between presence and absence, which of course is in a way connected to the artworks that we've seen, especially the female artist artworks. So I'm specifically thinking of Wolfish, of Hicks, but also Ringgold. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, so the extreme materiality of their artworks, but at the same time a constant hint to the absence, to the silence, to the void in a way, which I think could also be said of their relationship with language. Mm-hmm. So interestingly, the piece that you showed us at the beginning, the one that is also partly on the cover of the textile reader,
yes,
is entitled Language.
Yeah.
And well, so it's something that is referenced from the title, but of course a big part of it is devoted to silence, mm-hmm, right? So emptiness and void and fullness, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, also Hicks, what we just said about the book, and the materiality, the heaviness of the book, but the ghosts of the artwork. But I was also looking and thinking while we were speaking about the works that she exhibited in Malaga, and some of them were actually referenced and names as words. Mm-hmm. No, but of course, so you have the words referenced in the title, although the language chosen is French. Mm. But then, of course, you have material threads. Mm. So again, it's language in absence, but counterbalanced by an extreme presence. Yeah. And in Ringgold's, we could maybe say the same thing when you were talking about the quilt dedicated, inspired to the color purple. So she's referencing a book, and one of the most famous book of certain history of American literature and African American literature specifically. But at the same time, I mean, the book, of course, is not there, and she chose handwriting, you said, mm-hmm, that I hadn't grasped this information before, mm-hmm, which is at once, at the same time, an extremely material thing, yeah, because it's the most material way we can address language through the body. And mm-hmm, the handwriting is something peculiar, specific of each and every one of us, just like the voice. Mm-hmm. So it's very material, but at the same time, it's not printing. So it's a way of distancing her work and herself from the material sphere of the book. Yeah. So I don't know if all these things that I put together make any kind of sense, but I think what strikes me the most is this dynamics in mm-hmm, between silence and voice and languages that are there and then there are not.
Yes, yeah. And as I said, I think that many of these examples can be more than one thing at the same time. So to bombard you with another example, the woman that I wrote my PhD on, Yvonne Vera, started her own PhD with a reference to a woman called Ruth First, who was held under South Africa's 90-day detention law multiple times. So during apartheid, you could hold somebody without reason for 90 days, and then you would release them and they would walk down the street and you would just arrest them again and start it all over to break protesters' spirits, yeah. And it was solitary confinement that Ruth First was held in. And Yvonne Vera picks up on a beautiful passage from her memoir where she talks about stitching, again with a piece of thread unraveled from her clothing, a calendar hidden inside the lapel of her clothing to try and hold on to time and count these days and convince herself that this was something she could survive. I'm throwing that out as an example because it is silence and not silence, and I don't mean to be taking us back into the dark stuff again. We can get happy, but that ability for it to be both at the same time. I mean, I also think on a very different level of conversation, isn't there something extraordinarily respectful about waiting for the artwork to be inside? There's also enormous problem with textile exhibitions and textile research in general, I think, and that's typically you can't touch them in an exhibition space to protect the artifact. That's, we don't go in and try and put our hands on oil paintings. But when it's such a significant component to how we understand things, I think we lose more without that knowledge than, for instance, not being able to touch a photograph. Or they're also difficult to photograph, and by this I mean the very best photographer often struggles to capture something that when you see it in person. And so, I mean, the photography, I know they made a huge effort with the photography here, that nothing, maybe it's not that different from hearing a poet recite their poetry or read, nothing takes the place of actually experiencing something live or something firsthand. But I have always had this little sneaking feeling that textiles suffer more from this than, for instance, some amazing architectural photography. Often people would say, the photography is more seductive than you go and stand in those buildings, and it's okay, but actually there's another layer of art form then there are other art forms such as graphic design, or they're already set up to be on a screen. It's fine. So I think textiles really draw quite a short stick with this part of things, that we can't just spend our lives going to textile exhibitions, although I would be the first to volunteer if anybody ever made that a job. But so we're often accessing reproductions, and more so now than ever with things being online. So sort of pulling back from that representation, and as you said, sort of, it is not a textile, it's not to be confused with a textile, but it is still such an extraordinarily inviting physical thing. And I'm sure all of you own books that you can't keep the pages open, and you've always got to stick, it behaves itself as, it works on all sorts of levels. But it is, as you said, it's coming through a not filling up a space, but leaving it. Yes. And I must confess, I was torn when I saw the cover to the Textile Reader, because I know that it needs to be colorful. And at the same time, I know that that's actually quite a misrepresentation of the artwork in totality.
No, but that's what's interesting is also how this kind of books are made, and this goes for the simple cover, so to speak, of an academic book or a book that is supposed to be an anthology on textile, and for a book that is supposed to be an artwork per se. Mm-hmm. Of course, you always have to, even us who publish academically, we have to understand and compromise for the need of a book that also is that of selling, of course. So you need to adapt in a way, although this is a very particular object.
And interestingly, there is an interview on the Louisiana channel, the museum in Denmark, that has quite a lot of open access videos, an interview with the book designer. Yeah. And over and over and over again, she says, I do not compromise.
I do not compromise.
I do not. And apparently, it was really almost cancelled and quite a thing. And so I agree with you. I'm not in a position to say that in my job, but it's interesting what that I do not compromise finally results in.
So she didn't compromise at all for this book, and the fact that it doesn't bear the title on the cover is just a mistake? Or
she described it that way, as just a mistake, but you can imagine that this is not an inexpensive book to produce. And she talks also about just having this assurance inside her own imagination of what it needed to look like, but often really struggling to convey that to others, and that it's not a conventional exhibition catalogue, and so whenever anybody does something that isn't sort of similar to something they've been shown before, it's a risk.
Yes, you wouldn't say that is an exhibition catalog, right?
Yeah.
It's also, you were saying that it's not easy to handle, so you have to make an effort to keep the pages open, and that goes very much into the direction of many difficult, so to say, book objects that we have seen. We have learned, as many of you have said during the past sections in this class, that books can be almost anything, right? And whatever you thought could never be a book has turned out to be possibly one, right? So that certainly is, a confirmation of that. Questions? So that we can move on with the debate.
Or thoughts, if there's something
curiosity, yeah.
that you connect it to from your previous sessions as well, or maybe don't connect it to, want to say, wow, but this is really doesn't add up to some of the ways that we've talked or approached other things. You can tell me I've fallen down my textile rabbit hole, and when I come up for oxygen, you speak to me again.
Okay. Paula, and then Olga.
I wanted to know if you have observed artists incorporating eco-friendly practices in their choice of textile or printing mold methods, and how does this environmental consciousness influence the narrative or reception of their work within the art community?
This is something that I try to be very careful about, because we all know how much greenwashing there is in the world, and so how often, particularly fashion companies, are selling things to us when it might be one tiny component of one collection. I'm also not trained in the sciences and didn't do very well in high school. To actually be able to separate out some of this information and know when it's greenwashing or know when it's something else, it just makes me nervous that we run and jump on this bandwagon. So I've certainly interviewed artists, maybe particularly about a decade or 15 years ago, who sometimes actually felt a little bit hijacked by journalists who spun a sustainable narrative around their practice, because those are the stories that we want to read. And it wasn't something that they were pushing, in part because they weren't 100% sure, or didn't really want to be scrutinized in that way, or even if it was secondhand this or recycled that, that wasn't what they wanted to be known for. So I think that it is an ever-increasing component, and of course it's something that we need to take responsibility for, but a little bit, I suppose, like my slight attack on the romanticization agenda, I also know I am not qualified to tell you if we're being told something dishonest about the chemistry of that, and there are all sorts of counterintuitive examples that cotton is extremely thirsty to grow, and so to say, oh, but I've just, bought myself an all-cotton wardrobe, I'm not using those synthetics, doesn't bring into account how much energy I'm using. It's so complicated. And so I think that there are practices that probably take all the steps they can to educate themselves, and we are being told reasonable information. And then I think that there are probably people who are making naive mistakes, and we are maybe naive as viewers. The batik book covers that I told you about, that's a prison in Semarang on the island of Java, which continues to make batik today with the women prisoners. And it is described as an eco-collection, and I have not yet understood what that could mean. A lot of things, and I'm not actually criticizing any of them. But that part of it always makes me a little bit nervous, because we do sort of sometimes get into this rather fluffy mindset around textiles. Yes. And maybe if it was something else, you'd be, oh, well, I'm going to check that. And sometimes it comes with this a little bit doing too good. And the truth is there's manipulation out there as well.
Yes, because in this sense, we could even talk about some recycled materials for the artists you were describing at the beginning. Now the names, like I don't remember the name exactly, but he was the one. Exactly, the one who was committed in psychiatric institutions for a big part of his life, who was actually using found materials.
Yes.
So it was reassembling and reusing.
Yeah.
It's a form of recycling, but at the same time, it's a problematic and painful form of recycling. So it's not just the green issue, to be a stake there.
Yeah.
So
and we do now have some very on-point research that is coming from colleagues. Maybe I'm familiar a little bit more with the African context, where they're saying, recycling, closing the manufacturing loop. We've always done that. So, okay, you've got this new idea and you're really excited about it, but there have been contexts that have never not done that. So I think it's about that responsibility of how much we need to learn along the way as well. And I have to admit, when it comes to something like this, for the first time just a couple of days ago in the Guardian newspaper, the UK newspaper, The Guardian, there is finally an article about something I have long believed in myself, which is we remember something like 1/8 of our online reading compared to our paper reading. And I have, in the pandemic, I bought myself a Kindle and I cannot remember what I have read. It is amazing. And this article actually, it's talking a bit more about the fact that social media isn't written in such complex sentence structures. It's not activating your reading brain in the same way, but fundamentally. So I also need to be careful, because I'm always the one that has to print what I've written to proofread it. That has to read other people's writing on the page to see it differently. And I don't think we talk about this enough, and so I use a lot of paper. Yes, it is a crime, but otherwise my brain is somewhere else. It's quite, and with so many online journals, it's very deceptive to realize that I write in things, but I also do that, I think, to remind myself of what I'm doing, which of course it's not the same as just the highlight function on a PDF. So that was a tangent, but sometimes you have to make your own decisions about this as well.
I feel you completely. I do the same. And then I keep everything. So I have my own personal archives, multiples of stacks of papers that sometimes I forget what they are, and then they. Yeah. But it makes a whole difference.
Yeah.
Alejandro.
Yeah.
When I was reading one of your articles, like That's Not Your Story. And I found that Faith Ringgold was inspired by one of these books. I think it was the Purple Color. Mm-hmm. And there was some reference to a man doing quilting. I don't remember the rest. Yeah. So I was, and I don't remember he was saying that he would enjoy it even if others would make fun of him.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have found in real world men who have dared to explore with textile, and if so, how they have been perceived by their community, because this is something that has been attributed to women, and because of that, men who would like to try with this might be not so welcome.
Yes, yeah, I understand. I think that people make these choices for different reasons, and maybe it's also something that's changing quite rapidly now. I think that there are certainly in textile courses and art schools where I've worked, maybe a little bit like literature departments, they do tend to have a lot more female students than men, and it's often discussed why why do more women choose to study textiles? Because the statistics at the other side of the industry are, it's usually men that are in the most powerful business positions in these types of industries, but it is not a particularly balanced area gender-wise in education. I think that some people use that quite intentionally as a type of surprise factor. There was an exhibition maybe 20 years ago now called Men Who Sew in London. And it was not very well reviewed, and the curator, her name was Janice Jeffries, she sort of said afterwards, people didn't get the joke, it was I knew what I was doing when I put a show like that together. But I think some people know what you said about the association, and they just choose to set that aside and ignore it and say these are just things that I love, or maybe I have an ability or a talent with. I've certainly interviewed artists who've also referred to a male artist who possibly was raised by his grandmother or something, and it's a passing through the generations. The hair carpet weavers is an awful dystopia, but craft knowledge does move through generation, and this is typical. And then maybe in the last decade as well, you would see a lot more practices that are actually very interested in gender politics, using textiles specifically because of that. So it sort of left the feminist waves, and now continues to be used. Maybe for a similar reason as to what I was saying about the stereotype of, if you think that you want to pigeonhole this as one type of work or one type of person, then this is the perfect thing for me to use to show you something else. So sometimes it's intentional, but sometimes it is just the materials that people are drawn to and have an affinity to, in the same way, we're not that easy to explain our taste in music or some other things. But I think that would be a question that probably has had the most change in recent years as well. Yeah.
That's true.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a comment, I guess, and a question. So first of all, I want to thank you for just such a lovely introduction to textiles. It's new to me, and so it's just been this kind of exciting topic that I didn't know about. So I'm so appreciative of that, and the idea of mixing the textiles with the text in particular. It's just sometimes maybe just pointing out the obvious, because you're seeing it, but you don't connect it that it's actually a communication, the vehicle of communication. So I've been really appreciative about that. But what struck me about what you were saying is there's such a variety of textiles. And so even in the presentation, you're mentioning the quilting and the book covers and sheets and all the different textiles. So I was curious how, and you have so many different interests too, how does a project come to your attention, or how do you find that next thing that you were talking about that you're looking for? But then how does something come across your desk, so to speak? Because the book covers in particular, seems very remote and very, just how would you know about that, or how does that come to your attention in the event that you want to work on it?
Yeah. So this is absolutely nothing that you can sit down in front of the library catalog system and run a search engine on it. So for instance, the university where I work, the library is offering all of these classes about do data surveys in your area to find all of the things that have already been published, and you think I think I skipped that workshop. It's I'm very motivated by a task or an opportunity. So for instance, the reason how we met was a conference invitation, where I then, I suppose, wind myself backwards into the hair carpet weavers. As I think I said, was a dear friend sent me a photograph from a bookshop she was standing at, somebody I studied we did our MAs together in comparative literature, so she knows that I've got this thing, absolute pure chance that I rely on. And the literary part of it, when I try to tell people that I'm interested in what textiles do in stories, they just look at me very blankly. And then you just need to give one or two examples, and usually people are throwing examples at you. Oh, but have you thought about the such and such? You know, because they're knitting the whole time. Or so a little bit like what you just said about textiles, and it's also the thing that I like about them. It's not, if you haven't studied them, they're actually sort of an undercurrent of a lot of decision-making that's happening anyway. The batik book covers, that fellowship is set up with the invitation. Rita Boland was their textile curator. She is no longer alive, but she, as a young woman, lived in Indonesia. And the fellowship is an invitation to work on something in their collection. And I was actually avoiding batik because it just seemed like much too much of a cliche, and not being a big believer in conventionally searching for things. One day I just started to go through the online archive just piece by piece, not through any type of strategy. And I couldn't then let go of the idea that they were book covers that didn't hold books. You know, so that was sort of what got me. But there's a terrible irony to that project, because my proposal was that I found objects that lacked information in the archive, that didn't have histories attached to them, and I paired them with existing fiction and commissioned fiction writers to sort of speculate on these missing histories. The problem with the book covers is the histories are not missing at all. The more I looked, the more I found, which was deeply annoying because I wanted them to be silent. That was what I had proposed. You know, we have to tell these stories because we know nothing else. And speaking of language, I don't read Dutch, but that is actually how that project was controlled, because I was with another writer looking for batik textile covers, and they popped up in the Smithsonian collection in the US. The Smithsonian records them as prison work. And then we noticed that actually they're the same cloth, and I don't know how they got separated. But it's my inability to read Dutch that pushed me to English sources. And then I can't get lost in the archive because I can't read any of it. So I'm just looking for the word prison and the word batik in all of the archive records. And then I translate a page if I find those things on it. So it's alarmingly random to balance a whole career on. But somehow it keeps feeding itself in different ways. And I know that it looks very eclectic to other people, and as far as I'm concerned, I've almost studied the whole thing my whole life, the same thing my whole life. You know, just the back and forth between these two things. Yeah. But
that's fascinating. To me, it's very fascinating, truly. I mean, the material part of this, because of course you're speaking about realizing you were handling, we're talking about the same materials, but you had to physically go and see, like touch the material or not. You cannot do this kind of research through a screen, even if you're searching through the online archive. So it has to be a material archive in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, and that, I guess, sometimes proves difficult because you have to physically go and search for things, which in a way, it's another form of irony, because textile, in our imagination, as romantic as it can be, is something that we are used to touch in our daily life, right? While many of these artworks are either far away, we have to travel to exhibitions, and then I don't think we can touch it, right? They cannot be touched.
Yes.
So how do you, I mean, that's also like connects to Olga's question, because it's a personal curiosity. Don't you think that, I don't want to say we're missing something, but shouldn't touch be part of the experience in a way? I mean, I don't know how this relates to the world of art and the necessity of preserving, which is also the need of the archive. So I don't know if they allow you to touch with your bare hands, so you have to wear gloves, and how that changes the whole experience of the textile.
Yeah. I mean, the first part of your question, actually, it was half and half. So I have not seen the textiles in the Smithsonian in person. But I might not have a memory for languages, but I do have a memory for patterns. And so it was in part seeing the textiles in the Tropen and then remembering when I was looking in this other archive, there is no chance that was made in two separate places. They're too similar. The thing about touching those textiles in the archive, which would require speculative writing, and we are trying this with the project, is these are actually quite badly made textiles, badly made batik. And they were made by women in prison. Did they want to make them? Were they forced to make them? I had this whole decolonial agenda that there was a Dutch man running the batik workshop, and he was supposedly teaching the women, which I argued about and thought this is such local knowledge, it's not necessary. But now I've found records that acknowledge all of that, and the women were teaching each other. And so I think we also have to recognize what all the knowledge we don't have in sort of common society at the moment, that we are more and more distanced from these things. But those textiles in particular, and maybe the reason why they've not been exhibited or people haven't worked on them, is they're messy. There's drips on the edges. They're not, and also they represent learning. This is people learning how to do something. Whereas when we go to exhibitions, we usually see either the most amazing thing, or at least it's attached to somebody's very important name. So, okay, it's not the best of Chanel, but still it's a Chanel, so we'll look at it. Whereas this is anonymous, and I think a lot of people have written about that as a problem with craft, rather than anonymous can mean collective. And increasingly people are very interested in this idea, but I don't own this knowledge singularly. And maybe that is where art and craft get a little bit different or have a bit of a dispute with each other, that this was shared knowledge. It's not somehow my singular genius that created something. And I think that's starting to excite mainstream artists more as well. But the fact that these are not special, I like that in a strange way. But I wonder under what condition. I think there had to have been some choice in these workshops, because not everybody participated. So I think if you really hated it, but there are very difficult questions about patience and discipline and control. Why if you're in prison, why do you have to be a patient person? Why do you have to be carry yourself in a certain way, or like to do this detailed work? In a South African prison that I read about, it's Dutch lace work being produced. Many people would just say, this is not a hobby, this is torture. It's so detailed.
The hair carpet
so it's a very and the hair carpet weaver. So it's a very particular type of person that is meant to function in these. And it runs into the contemporary a bit. I don't know. I'm still working on it.
But what do you think? I mean, yeah, in the Indonesia, because the Dutch influence. But what do you think? They're so keen in prison environments to push people to textile work, which
the Indonesian example we're talking about the turn of the last century, and there was prison reform throughout Europe at that time. But the irony was maybe in Indonesia, the Dutch reformed the prisons there before the prisons in the Netherlands. So it was a wave. It was a particular wave of sentiment at the time that the prison would be a place where you would recover yourself, and of course the colony being the place where you would learn to be somehow this better person anyway. But they were, so I'm talking about batik, but there was a variety of work that was done, and then that really tipped off, and the prison returned to being a place of punishment. And things were taken away from you in that context, because that was what the function was. So it seems like it goes in cycles. I said I'd end on a light note, so I've got to have one more question.
Absolutely.
We can't end on that one.
We have to end more positively. No, we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But it was definitely interesting. Come on, Cristina.
Around two questions. About Sheila Hicks' article, Traveling Threads, the one you wrote.
Yeah.
Which could have been her source of inspiration to create those vivid, colorful artworks?
Traveling, there have been a lot of Sheila Hicks exhibitions, but Traveling Threads in particular did a really beautiful job of placing quite a lot of her photography, often taken quite early in her life, next to weavings that she did later. Not necessarily as color references, because quite a lot of the photography was black and white, but you have remarkable images of the texture of a corrugated door to a garage, for instance, and you can see all of the bumps, and then you can see a textile next to it that has those same types of rhythms. Or houses on a floodplain, so they're up on these incredible stilts, and then you can see some of her works that are just these bars in space. So not so much color, but structurally, I think I think that's why it was called Traveling Threads. It comes from that time. And the people that work with color, it seems like either they have an addiction and an instinct to it, or they don't. I don't know if it's always a literal, this plant came from here and so I borrow the color that way. I think it's a lot more instinctive. Hicks is also really quite unusual in that she has done a lot of very large art commissions, but she's also done a lot of very large hardcore design commissions. So that would be something for a boardroom or a lecture theatre, or it doesn't happen so much now, but big corporate headquarters, those types of things. And those are contexts where there's usually a huge amount of control around fire safety, if something would be dangerous if there was a fire. So you have to work with the materials and the budgets, sometimes in a very, very controlled way. So I think one part of it is inside herself, inside her imagination, and another part of it is absolutely, she had a Fulbright. That was what took her to South America in the first place. And then I think she just keeps on studying these structures over and over again. Yeah.
And the next question is, how would you define her works and the impact it may have in society?
Yeah. So
I'm curious about that.
So in that piece of art writing that you're talking about, I tried to celebrate the small and the modest things that she's done. It's a theme with me, isn't it? But I mean, this project is exactly that as well. It was only about the small works, and the writing was published. It's always the death bell. The writing was published, and then I thought I'll send it to her and see what she says. And of course, she sends me back her latest exhibition somewhere in France with this absolutely gigantic sculpture with her standing under it. And I looked at it and I thought, I don't know if you're politely trying to tell me that you completely disagree with the premise of what I've written, or if it was just I think that she just moves back and forth on these incredible scales. But the how her work is defined is actually the fact that she never stayed in one place. There's a lot of people that work on textile history, or particularly textile art history. There's so much anxiety about whether it's respected enough that often people can be very, very controlling. Don't call me a designer because I'm an artist, or don't call me a craft person, and it comes out of sense of not being respected enough. And she seems like her whole career has just been incredibly flexible. Design commissions, artistic commissions, very large, very small. It was almost as though she just didn't ever get worried about that, which may be a good lesson for all of us.
Yeah. She didn't care.
Yeah.
That's probably key to
Yes.
to a happy life and a happy production, whether arts or crafts, we might call it, right?
Yeah, the categories are definitely, the students that I teach now, this is what art schools and museums and galleries are worried about. It's not what young artists are talking about. You know, is this design or is it art? There are so many examples that it's just a very blended mixture of everything. But we still exist in institutions that have departments and have job titles, and museums also, you know, I collect this, therefore we can't collect that.
It's the need to define everything, and which brings us back to the problem of the archive, because if you cannot define, then you cannot catalog. In you know, what kind of archive? An archive without catalog becomes a labyrinth, right? A maze.
Yes, and it is absolutely a labyrinth in the hair carpet weavers. And I'm not spoiling the story if I tell you, of course, eventually there is a hair carpet in there, but they spend a long time looking in the wrong places for it. And I think that's one of the morals of the story as well, is you can collect all of this human knowledge, and if you lose the key, you may as well have not collected it.
Exactly. But we said we were not going to close on the poor Eschbach. I feel a bit guilty that we're. I mean, actually, I found it extremely fascinating. I first heard it when you were talking about it during the conference in summer, and I have to say it was like a shock wave. You know, like I have to read it. I have it in my reading list, but it's fascinating. So, but let's try to close on a more positive note. If we can abuse of your time a little bit longer, if we have any other questions from the students, Maria.
I'll try to not take too much time. I wanted to ask you if do you think that there is room for queer studies in craftism? Because I think it's really important also because in your article you mentioned intersectionality, which I think is very significant, and trying to show and define women's identity through craft.
Yes, yeah. I think along with the question about gender, this is something that artists have addressed a lot more recently. I think that it also depends on what definition of queering something you want to use, because there are many people who would also say maybe craft has always been queer in the sense of it being something that questions from the margins and doesn't try to conform to the status quo. So it depends on what way you want to use that word. The only thing I worry about with some of those debates is similar to what I've said before. You know, whose context are we talking about? Whose freedoms are we talking about? And whose craft? Because there are so many contexts where these conversations are absolutely not possible. And craft exists, and it can't be anything about any of those questions or mechanisms, and it is completely oppressive and something very different. And I am interested in craft because it is around our world. You're not because it is just one thing in a very particular museum. So I do always feel like, yes, in many of the places that we sit and work in now, but globally, no, we then have to be very, very careful about not taking our own freedoms for granted and remembering all of the other people in the world with probably very similar questions who have to enact them completely differently. And then the other part about craft has maybe always had at least that identity in comparison to mainstream art is often something that people play with as well. And I think that works very well as long as we just make sure we define what particular type of context and don't overlook the freedoms that other people don't have. Yeah.
Anything Anything else? One?
So the answer by Sheila Hicks on the previous slides reminded me of the peoples of the country.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I wanted to know your thoughts on the possibilities of the textile and the pattern to create a system of communication.
Yeah, yeah. Are people familiar with what you pronounce it correctly?
You can answer that.
I mean, I think it's not 1,000% known how they. I mean, I don't think it's. We were talking earlier about translation. I think this is, on one level, we know that they carried messages, and exactly how is maybe still a little bit up for debate. I think it's absolutely one of her reference points, and it's an artist that I didn't talk about, which maybe would also interest you a lot, is Cecilia Vaikuna, who has had some big exhibitions recently, and she just makes huge. And actually is another example of a poet, textile person, and the language is meant to be in both. There are all sorts of examples of where those message carriers are completely literal, or also something that is symbolic. And I suppose the only thing I wonder about is. Do we properly understand some of those traditions when we reference them? And I think probably someone like Sheila Hicks, in the time that she spent traveling, yes, it's fine. And I absolutely don't want to be the person that says you can only be interested in the things that somehow connect to your nationality or the place that you're standing. I think that's a really terrible way to look at the world, and I don't have much interest in England. I don't want to be told that that's the place I have to be interested in. But at the same time, sometimes there are examples where these traditions are understood so superficially, and then I sort of say, well, we all need to go back to history class and just teach ourselves a little bit more. Not because you can't do it because you're not from South America or you don't speak that language, but more just slow down a little bit, because maybe the thing that textiles do suffer from is it's quick. It's easy to treat them as something that's not sophisticated. And I did say that if some of those things are enjoyed just on an aesthetic beauty level, I think those artists would be happy. I mean, I don't think that, but it does sadden me sometimes that I wonder, do you really understand, both in a making but also in how much knowledge maybe was being carried? I think we're a little quick to assume we understand what these things are. The very European version of that example is also that embroidery samplers, and this is a little bit hard to wind back to believe, but women were taught the basics of the alphabet and also sort of basic mathematics through stitch, because paper was so expensive. And that's something that we sort of lose, but that literacy, and it was a very basic type of reading literacy, but to be honest, it was also that's now your employable skill. If you don't marry, then you have that as an embroidery skill. But some embroidery samplers, it is also sort of the basic reading lessons as well. But there are so many other communication systems. And I think that we need to give them a bit more credit, even if what we have to give credit to is what we don't know. You know, that there probably was much more to them. Yeah.
Fascinating, really, truly fascinating.
Well, I wanted to ask you, well, you have been talking before about that, but I would like to know is there any work of art or any artist that shocked you the most? Like, you were like completely shocked about, in the case of an artist, their work, or in the case of a work of art, this piece?
Do you mean shocked good?
Yeah.
Or bad.
Nice shock. Yeah.
I know it's a difficult question.
Yeah, I'm just forgetting his name, and so it's going to be embarrassing now. There's a Dutch artist who I've written about quite a bit, who exhibits these blocks of indigo, square, solid cubes of the dark blue indigo dye. Vincent Wulsma. I got there in the end.
Impressive.
I was going to have to think of someone else because I couldn't remember his name. But what impressed me, so they're very beautiful to look at. Each one is different. They would be exhibited on the gallery floor in a pattern. But the work has quite a few different steps to it. And one is that he was traveling in India, the subcontinent of India, and was able to visit an indigo plantation. And if he is invited to have an exhibition, he commissions the workers on that plantation to produce more blocks of indigo for him. And if he has another exhibition, he doesn't pull those blocks of indigo out of his storage room and say, here you go, we'll exhibit them again. He really forces the art machine to pay for a new set of blocks to be commissioned. And of course, this is very difficult when it might be the wrong season. There might be a delay and you miss your date for the exhibition, but he talks about the fact that I need to show how many other people are part of the work that I make. And also, I don't sit on this and then sort of harvest the profits over and over again, that the people who worked with the raw material should keep benefiting. It's a concept as much as anything else, and it's got other aspects to the project as well, which are interesting and very difficult, and we weren't going to go back into difficult things. But I think that's a very, very beautiful idea, to recognize that all of these materials, and somebody asked about sustainability or ecological concerns, the profit that is earned by the farmer who is making the cotton or something very basic compared to the shop or the gallery. We've got these real problems. There's also a South American studio called Hechusu who put beads across a whole wooden canoe. It's on the front of the Cultural Threads book, actually. And they talk about that canoe having been such a positive carrier of culture in the Amazon, and now being associated with such negative things of drug smuggling under the canopy of the rainforest. And they wanted to sort of return the canoe to its positive identity of a carrier of culture. So I suppose those are the types of things I'm drawn to, that they are absolutely beautiful to look at. I don't have a big thing for ugly things. I like beautiful things. But then there's quite a rich, and I suppose, yes, it is quite a political story underneath it, but it sort of comes out through beauty rather than through drama or something very tough. I think that is also a better way to keep people thinking than to show you something that upsets you so much you don't want to think about it ever again. So, yeah, I would have been better to show them, but yeah, there you go.
But we can definitely go look for them now that we have.
Yes.
Well, maybe we won't remember exactly the name of the Dutch artist, but we can Google Dutch artist who works with indigo, and maybe something will. We'll hear this when it gets published online. Excellent. So, Maria?
Each one of these works of art are certainly very unique, but they do have some things in common. So we've seen all these movements like Dadaism, Fluxus movement, and so on. So I was wondering if you think they could be part of a movement, maybe their own, or if you think each artist works in a more individual way.
is quite difficult to know in the moment. We have hindsight. There are also, of course, very smart people that name it at the time, but usually it's hindsight that confirms that's what was happening. Teresa Lancetta actually is another artist that I should have answered the previous question with. And in part because it's very similar to the things that I said about the other two examples. I think that there is a, well, I need to be careful. It's what I'm interested in, so I look for it. But I suppose I can maybe find a bit more of it at the moment, so maybe that's suggesting something. People who are very materially skilled and connected. They're not, they work with their hands and their hands know certain things. But also, like I just said about those other two examples, are not attracted to the individual identity of the artist. So Teresa Lancetta is Spanish, but has spent quite a lot of time working with weavers in the Middle Atlas Mountains in Morocco. And so she talks about collective knowledge, and that these things are not one person's ownership. And most textile patterns are not, you can't own them. You can own the Gucci brand, yeah? You can own, fashion branding is so different from a stripe or a block. These they appear around the world. So is that something that is increasingly of interest in the art world, and later it will be called a movement? These are people that are getting more and more mainstream exhibition invitations. So something is happening with that. But it's also the thing that I'm always searching for. So maybe I talk myself into an enthusiasm that nobody else. But no, it is well. You can well chart the fact that particularly in the last 5 years, there's been a massive increase in textile exhibitions in places that did not hold textile exhibitions before. And they do tend to have some type of collective sharing, trying to step back from the fact that one person is the genius in control of everything. So we could hope that sort of becomes something more solid in future, or it will just be the blip that I dreamed.
Yeah, true, it's true. So either one last question, and I will. I mean, if you're willing, and then we let you go. I promise.
I have two because I prepared one, but I just got another one. So
No problem.
I read your article about Ringgold, and if I remember correctly, you mentioned how quilting first started as more of a necessity and associated to slavery and the materials that the community had at hand, more than a form of art. So the names weren't attached to the pieces, and the authorship was suppressed. So I wondered whether you would consider important associating authorship to the quilt's creations to gain social and artistic power, and how that impacts the context and story of the quilts.
That's interesting in light of what I just said about these other examples, because one school of thought would say recovering some attribution of probably the women, but not entirely, but the women that made this, is conforming to a certain value system that wasn't really in the nature of the way the things were made. And some of them are not attributed to a name because of what I said about the collective work. We sat together and made this. I can't remember if you did that corner and I did another corner. It does depend a little bit. You asked the question, there are lots of different types of textiles, and it depends a little bit on what type of textile we're talking about. But a quilt, absolutely. It's very easy for you to do a section and me to do a section, and we meet and join them. And so I wonder if that type of recovery is also conforming too much to a system that was already a bit of a mismatch. I didn't show you this, but the first textile reader has a quilt on its on its cover. It's not blue, it's sort of reds and other colors, and it was made collectively. It's called the HTML quilt, I believe, organized, coordinated by an artist called L. Carpenter, but made by, and now the list is so long, and this was a difficult conversation with the publisher because using the image, in order to get permission to use the image on the cover, Elle, understandably, requested that every person making that quilt was named in the caption. And then you've got a publisher who's planned this much space for the caption, and they cannot conceive of another way. You know, the caption was half the page. That was her point. It's not a historical artwork, it was a contemporary one. So she was more acknowledging this was a community-based project. I know the names of these people, write them all down. I don't want it to be my thing. But I wonder a little bit in the past if we're recovering the wrong thing when we do that, that's sort of conforming it to a certain trajectory in art history that then says, and so we have our great single name people, and they're not always studying other things and absorbing other things and being influenced. I think now the difference is, and Teresa Lancet is a very beautiful example of this, people are just much, much more honest about where these things are coming from. So she will exhibit her textiles with a historical one next to it. So you can see, look, the stripes are the same pattern and she's made them bigger or smaller, or we're all doing that, including in anything that we write. You know, yes, we have footnotes and citations, and I'm not suggesting that we plagiarize, but we're always absorbing and mixing. And I mean, sort of the point of an education, you're being influenced. We can write better when we read more. You know, it's because we're being influenced. But I don't know about there are some difficult examples in Gee's Bend in the US when things become very valuable collector's items. Sometimes there are real tensions then over, you have to credit, you know, this money shouldn't all go to the gallery. Whose hands did this? But that's maybe a little bit different than what you're saying about, but should it be my name or should it be your name? Or is it actually just this, what was this conversation this evening? Well, wasn't it every voice at some point? I think there's starting to be a bit more comfort in not wanting to have it all. You had a second question.
Yeah. So this is the first time I've been to talk about textiles in general. So I found really interesting the connections with literature and textiles. So I wondered if you've encountered or made the connection with any musical creations and textiles.
Do you mean through song lyrics? Yeah. I know there have been a couple of operas that I know of that have worked with Greek myth or things like that. And maybe this is, I'm really just exposing myself now that I am absolutely not a musical person. So I'm sure there is, and that's your plan for the next week. I will find my novels with textiles in them. I bet you'll hear, because it's not about uncovering something that was lost. It was just about looking or hearing differently. It was there. It just wasn't noticed. So I have to say you really hit upon the non-expert for that one. But I wouldn't be surprised because it's so present in poetry, and so the difference between song lyrics and poetry is so small that I would and also if song lyrics, at least some of them, are about things that we can connect to. So You have to send me an example. You have to teach me. We end on that. You have to teach me that one.
Yes, like we end on we keep the dialogue open, hopefully, and we keep reflecting and thinking about all this textile world in which you have so generously tonight guided us, pointing out all the artistic, cultural, material, political, and gender issues. So really, we thank you for your time, for devoting 2 hours tonight to talking to us and explaining all this, answering to the very much engaged questions of my students, who I also thank. And it was really and truly a pleasure to have you here, and it was marvelous to hear you talk about textile. Thank you again for joining us.
Pleasure.